There is a version of the Vietnam War that most people carry around in their heads without ever questioning how it got there. It involves jungles, protests, tragic misunderstanding, a nation that meant well but lost its way. It involves the idea that if the right people had been in charge, or if the strategy had been slightly different, or if the public had held on a little longer, something might have been salvaged. That version is not history. That version is a story that was constructed during the war itself, maintained after the war ended, and has been reinforced in ways so consistent and so layered that it no longer resembles a narrative at all. It resembles a fact. And the first thing that needs to be said before anything else is that the Vietnam War was not misunderstood. It was misrepresented, deliberately, systematically, and from the very beginning, by the people running it. The distinction matters because misunderstanding implies error, and error implies the possibility of correction. Misrepresentation implies choice. It implies that people with access to accurate information chose to present a different version of that information to people who did not have equal access. And the documentary record of the Vietnam War, the actual classified reports, the field cables, the internal assessments, the private memos written by generals and secretaries of defense to presidents who publicly said the opposite of what those memos contained, that record is not ambiguous. People knew. They knew that the war was not going the way they said it was going. They knew that the metrics they were using to measure progress were either meaningless or actively misleading. They knew that the South Vietnamese government they were supporting was fragile in ways that no amount of American firepower could fix. They knew all of this. They said something else, and men went to die based on what they said. That is where the story actually begins. Not with the Gulf of Tonkin, not with the first advisors, not with the domino theory as it was explained to the American public. It begins with a fundamental decision that the management of perception mattered more than the management of reality. And once that decision was made, everything else followed from it with a kind of terrible logic. The body count was the clearest expression of that logic. At some point in the early phase of American combat involvement, someone decided that since it was difficult to measure territorial progress in a war without clear front lines, and since it was difficult to measure political progress in a country whose political situation was almost impossible to read from the outside, the most reliable metric of success would be enemy dead. If you were killing the enemy faster than the enemy could replace itself, you were winning. If the ratio of enemy killed to friendly killed was high enough, consistently enough for long enough, the enemy would eventually run out of men, and the war would be over. This was called the attrition strategy, and it had a kind of cold mathematical elegance that appealed to people who were more comfortable with statistics than with the reality those statistics were supposed to represent. The problem, which people identified almost immediately, and which was ignored almost as quickly as it was identified, was that the body count could not be verified. Bodies on a battlefield in the middle of a jungle, after an engagement that might have lasted minutes or hours and covered ground that was difficult or impossible to hold, could not be counted with any precision. And because the body count was the primary metric of success, and because careers advanced or stagnated based on the numbers a unit produced, there was an enormous institutional incentive to make the numbers as large as possible. And so they grew. Units reported engagements that had not occurred. Units reported enemy dead that were actually civilians. Units reported the same bodies multiple times. Units inflated small skirmishes into large victories. Units faced with pressure from above to produce results produced numbers instead of results, and sent those numbers up the chain of command, where they were aggregated and refined and converted into briefing slides that were presented to politicians and journalists as evidence that the war was being won. There were people inside the military system who knew this was happening. There were intelligence analysts and field commanders and lower-ranking officers who wrote reports describing what was actually occurring on the ground. Some of those reports made it to the top of the chain. Some of them were read by people in positions of authority. And in at least some documented cases, those people responded not by correcting the inflated numbers, but by pressuring the people who had submitted accurate numbers to revise them upward. The war had its own epistemology. Truth was not what the evidence showed. Truth was what the briefing required. By the mid-1960s, the weekly body count reports being sent from Saigon to Washington were presenting a picture of a war being steadily and decisively won. The kill ratio was favorable. Enemy losses were unsustainable. The end was always approximately 6 months away. This 6-month projection became so reliable in its unreliability that journalists eventually named it. They called it the light at the end of the tunnel, and the phrase became a kind of dark joke, because the light was always there, and the tunnel was always the same length regardless of how far you walked. Inside the military, the projection had a different name. Officers called it the optimism requirement, not always in those words, but the concept was precise. You were expected to be optimistic about the war's progress. Pessimism was not career-enhancing. The official assessment of enemy strength was one of the places this requirement created the most serious distortions. By 1967, the CIA and the military intelligence apparatus had been arguing for months about how many enemy combatants were actually operating in South Vietnam. The military's official estimate was around 270,000. The CIA's revised estimate, based on its own analysis of captured documents and interrogation reports and various other sources, was somewhere between 400,000 and 600,000. The difference was not small. It was not a rounding error. It was a fundamental disagreement about the basic facts of the war. And it mattered enormously, because if the enemy force was twice as large as the official number suggested, then the kill ratios that were being reported as evidence of progress were not evidence of progress at all. You could be killing enemy combatants at the rate the reports claimed, and the enemy could still be growing, still be replacing its losses, still be operating at full capacity because it had twice as many people to begin with. The resolution of this disagreement was not a careful analysis of the competing evidence. The resolution was a meeting in Saigon in the summer of 1967, at which the military's position essentially prevailed, not because the evidence supported it, but because the consequences of accepting the CIA's estimate were too large to absorb. If the enemy force was as large as the CIA believed, then years of reported progress were illusory. The strategy was not working. The light at the end of the tunnel did not exist. None of that could be officially acknowledged, so the lower number was used. A young CIA analyst named Sam Adams documented this process in extraordinary detail. His documentation was suppressed for years. When it eventually became public, the military disputed it. The dispute was never fully resolved in any institutional sense. The Tet Offensive began on January 31, 1968, during the Vietnamese New Year holiday, when North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces simultaneously attacked more than 100 cities and towns across South Vietnam, including a brief assault on the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. The offensive was eventually repelled. In military terms, the attacking forces suffered enormous casualties. By the metrics the military had been using to measure success, Tet should have looked like an American victory. The enemy had come out in the open, had attacked fixed positions, had fought in ways that made the body count metric actually meaningful for once, and had taken catastrophic losses. General William Westmoreland, the commander of American forces in Vietnam, called it a military defeat for the enemy. What the offensive revealed was not a military victory or defeat in any simple sense. What it revealed was the gap between the official picture of the war and the war as it actually existed. The official picture had described a country in which security was improving, in which the South Vietnamese government was gaining control, in which the enemy was being steadily degraded. The offensive showed that the enemy had the organizational capacity to plan and execute simultaneous attacks across the entire country. It showed that the security gains that had been reported were either greatly exaggerated or entirely fictional in many areas. It showed that the South Vietnamese cities that had supposedly been pacified were not pacified. It showed in a way that could not be managed or deflected that years of optimistic reporting had not corresponded to years of actual progress. The reaction inside the military establishment to this revelation was not a fundamental reassessment. It was, in many places, a search for explanations that would preserve the existing framework. The offensive had succeeded because of a breakdown in intelligence sharing. The offensive had succeeded because South Vietnamese forces had been inadequately trained. The offensive had succeeded because of factors that were correctable without requiring any acknowledgement that the basic strategy was wrong. This process of explanation without reassessment would continue for years. There was a study completed in 1967 by a team working for the Department of Defense, a study that its authors called an encyclopedic history of American involvement in Vietnam from its earliest stages to the present. The study was classified top secret. It ran to nearly 7,000 pages. It contained a systematic and detailed account of how decision after decision had been made on the basis of assumptions that the available evidence contradicted, how officials had routinely concealed their private doubts from the public while privately expressing those doubts to each other, how the war had been expanded in ways that its architects did not believe would produce the results they publicly claimed those expansions would produce. The study was completed in January 1969. It remained classified. In 1971, a researcher named Daniel Ellsberg, who had worked on portions of the study, copied it and provided copies to the New York Times and other newspapers. The newspapers began publishing excerpts. The Nixon administration sought a court injunction to prevent further publication, arguing that publication endangered national security. The Supreme Court ruled against the injunction. The papers were published. What the Pentagon Papers revealed, more than any specific fact they contained, was the texture of institutional deception over more than 2 decades. They showed that the Kennedy administration had been more deeply committed to military escalation than it had publicly acknowledged. They showed that the Johnson administration had planned for major escalations of the war months before the Gulf of Tonkin incident that was publicly used to justify those escalations. They showed that officials at every level had privately assessed the war as unwinnable, while publicly describing it as a war that was being won. The papers did not end the war. They did not produce any significant institutional accountability. Several officials whose private pessimism the papers documented continued in government service. The man who commissioned the study, Robert McNamara, had already left the Defense Department by the time the papers were published. The Gulf of Tonkin incident itself deserves close attention, not because it is unknown, but because the specific nature of what happened and what was known at the time is still not fully absorbed into the popular understanding of the war. On August 2, 1964, USS Maddox, an American destroyer operating in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The attack was real. The Maddox had been conducting intelligence-gathering operations in waters near North Vietnamese territory. The attack was repelled. On August 4, 1964, the commander of the Maddox reported that his ship was under attack again. Reports were sent to Washington. The Johnson administration presented the incident to Congress as a clear act of North Vietnamese aggression and requested authorization for military force. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which provided the legal basis for the major escalation of American involvement that followed. The second attack almost certainly did not occur. The Maddox was operating in poor weather conditions, and the crew was on high alert after the genuine attack 2 days earlier. Radar contacts that were interpreted as torpedo boats were almost certainly false returns caused by weather conditions. The attack that the commander initially reported was almost certainly not happening. There are recorded communications from that night showing that the commander himself was uncertain and was attempting to verify the reports before sending them up the chain. Those communications were available to officials in Washington who were making decisions about how to respond. The decision was made to treat the unverified reports as confirmed and to use them as the basis for requesting authorization for a major escalation of the war. Secretary of Defense McNamara told Congress the attack had occurred. He knew the evidence was uncertain. The resolution passed. Decades later, Intercepted North Vietnamese communications from that night were declassified. They showed no orders for any attack on August 4th. They showed North Vietnamese commanders discussing the genuine attack of August 2nd. They showed nothing that corresponded to the attack that the United States government told Congress had occurred. McNamara, in interviews conducted many years after the war, said that he believed the second attack had not happened. He did not resign. He did not publicly acknowledge this at the time it would have mattered. The resolution that the non-attack produced remained in effect for years and was used to justify operations that killed hundreds of thousands of people. The air war over North Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia operated on its own set of metrics and its own set of fictions. The bombing campaigns were enormous in scale. Operation Rolling Thunder, which began in 1965 and continued until 1968, involved hundreds of thousands of sorties and the delivery of more tonnage of bombs than had been dropped in all of World War II in the Pacific Theater. The stated objectives of the bombing shifted repeatedly. At various times, the bombing was supposed to interdict the supply lines running from North Vietnam into South Vietnam. At various times, it was supposed to demonstrate American resolve to North Vietnamese leadership and compel them to negotiate. At various times, it was supposed to destroy North Vietnam's industrial capacity. At various times, it was supposed to boost the morale of the South Vietnamese government. None of these objectives were fully achieved. The supply lines were damaged but never destroyed. North Vietnam's leadership did not substantially modify its behavior in response to the bombing. North Vietnam had limited industrial capacity to begin with, and what it had was dispersed and reconstituted quickly. The bombing continued anyway. The bombing of Laos is a separate and particularly stark chapter. Laos was officially neutral. The United States was publicly committed to respecting Laotian neutrality. Privately, the United States had been conducting covert military operations in Laos since the early 1960s, and beginning in 1964, began a bombing campaign that would eventually make Laos the most heavily bombed country per capita in human history. Between 1964 and 1973, American aircraft dropped more than 2 million tons of ordnance on Laos. The bombing was classified. Congress was not fully informed. The American public was not informed. The legal basis for the bombing was uncertain at best. The primary target was the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the network of paths and roads running through Laos and Cambodia that was used to supply North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces in South Vietnam. The bombing did not stop the flow of supplies. It killed an estimated 200,000 Laotian civilians. It left somewhere between 80 million and 130 million unexploded cluster munitions in the ground, where they continue to kill and maim people today. That last fact is not historical. It is present tense. The cluster munitions were designed to be fused so that a certain percentage would not immediately detonate on impact, but would instead lie in the ground and detonate later, either when disturbed or when the fuse eventually triggered on its own. The military called these delayed arming munitions. The people of Laos call them bombies. Children find them while farming. They detonate during harvests. Organizations are still clearing them from fields that were bombed more than 50 years ago. The clearing effort, funded by international donors including the United States, is expected to take decades more. There is no projection for when it will be complete. The Phoenix program was one of the most systematic and least publicly discussed components of the American war effort in South Vietnam. It was a joint CIA and military program designed to identify and neutralize the political infrastructure of the National Liberation Front, which was the formal name for the organization that American officials and media called the Viet Cong. The theory was that the guerrilla war in South Vietnam was sustained by a hidden civilian infrastructure, a network of village-level cadres, tax collectors, recruiters, intelligence agents, and political organizers who provided the material and human foundation for the military campaign. If that infrastructure could be systematically destroyed, the military effort would eventually collapse for lack of support. The program operated from approximately 1968 to 1972. It developed files on hundreds of thousands of suspected Viet Cong infrastructure members. It relied on a network of provincial interrogation centers. It authorized the capture, interrogation, and, in some cases, the killing of people identified as members of the infrastructure. The official history of the program, as presented by its designers and administrators, describes it as a legitimate intelligence and law enforcement operation that operated within established rules of engagement. The documented history of the program, drawn from the testimony of people who participated in it and from internal reports that eventually became declassified, describes something considerably different. The program's quota system was one of its defining characteristics. Provincial officials and district officials were given numerical targets for the number of Viet Cong infrastructure members they were expected to neutralize each month. The pressure to meet those targets created the same incentive structure that had corrupted the body count. People who could not actually identify and capture genuine members of the infrastructure could meet their quotas by identifying and capturing people who were not members of the infrastructure. People in local disputes could be denounced as Viet Cong. Personal enemies could be named. Civilians who had done nothing could be processed through the interrogation system, which was not gentle. The internal review processes that were supposed to verify identifications before people were detained were often perfunctory or non-functional. The program's administrators reported that it had neutralized, meaning captured, killed, or caused to defect, more than 80,000 members of the Viet Cong infrastructure during its operational period. William Colby, who directed the program and later became director of the CIA, maintained until the end of his life that the program was effective and operated within appropriate boundaries. Former participants in the program, testifying before Congress and in various other forums, described systematic torture at the provincial interrogation centers, the killing of prisoners who could not be held or transported, the use of the program to settle personal and political scores, and other practices that were substantially at variance with the official account. The truth of what happened in those centers during those years remains contested, not because the evidence is absent, but because the institutional will to fully examine it has been. The treatment of prisoners, both American prisoners held by North Vietnam and prisoners held by American and South Vietnamese forces, presents one of the war's most complex and uncomfortable factual records. The American prisoners held in North Vietnam, primarily airmen shot down during the bombing campaigns, were subjected to significant mistreatment. Many were tortured, some died in captivity. The North Vietnamese used the prisoners as propaganda assets and as bargaining chips. All of this is well documented and widely acknowledged. Less widely acknowledged is the systematic mistreatment of prisoners held by South Vietnamese forces, which American advisors frequently witnessed and about which they wrote reports that went largely unacted upon. The tiger cages of Con Son Island, a South Vietnamese prison facility, became public in 1970 when 2 American congressional aides were taken on an unauthorized visit to the facility and published photographs of prisoners being held in stone cells so small that the prisoners could not stand upright, many of them showing signs of severe malnutrition and physical abuse. The photographs produced a brief public controversy. South Vietnamese officials denied the accounts. American officials expressed concern and promised review. The conditions were modified in visible ways. The underlying system continued. The use of torture during interrogation by both South Vietnamese and American personnel was documented in enough detail that it cannot be treated as exceptional or aberrational. It was a feature of the intelligence system. Techniques used included water immersion, electrical shock applied to genitals and other sensitive areas, beating, and various forms of stress position. Some of these techniques were refined over time. Some were taught in training environments. The people who designed and supervised these interrogation programs were not rogue actors operating outside the system. They were operating within a system that needed information and was not particularly constrained about how it was obtained. The massacre at My Lai in March 1968 is the event that most reliably surfaces in any discussion of American war crimes in Vietnam. partly because it was documented and eventually prosecuted, and partly because its scale was impossible to explain away as a mistake or a misidentification. On March 16, 1968, soldiers from Charlie Company of the 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Division, entered the hamlet of My Lai in Quang Ngai Province on what was described as a search and destroy mission. They encountered no armed resistance. They found an unarmed civilian population consisting primarily of women, elderly men, and children. Over the course of several hours, they killed between 300 and 500 people. They burned the hamlet. They threw people into wells and dropped grenades in after them. They committed sexual violence. They killed livestock. They destroyed food stores. The massacre was reported by several soldiers who were present and who found it intolerable. Their reports were suppressed or ignored at multiple levels of the command structure for more than a year. The massacre became public when a journalist named Seymour Hersh, working on a tip from a former soldier, published an account of it in November 1969. The publication produced enormous controversy. A military investigation was opened. 14 officers were charged. 1 was convicted. Lieutenant William Calley was convicted of murdering 22 civilians and sentenced to life in prison. He served 3.5 years of house arrest before being pardoned by President Nixon, who had received enormous public support for the pardon. The public support was real. A significant portion of the American population believed that Calley had been scapegoated, that he had been following orders, that the entire prosecution was politically motivated. What the investigation that preceded the prosecution did not fully pursue was the question of how far up the chain of command knowledge of the massacre had extended and how the cover-up had been organized. The investigation found that the immediate cover-up had involved officers at the company, battalion, and brigade level. Whether it extended further was not conclusively established. It is known that General Westmoreland received a letter from a soldier named Ronald Ridenhour in April 1969, describing what had occurred at My Lai in detail. It is known that an investigation was eventually ordered. It is also known that the Army's Criminal Investigation Division had conducted an inquiry in 1968 and had concluded that the allegations of civilian deaths were unsubstantiated. My Lai was not an isolated incident. This is one of the most consistently documented and consistently under-acknowledged facts about the American experience in Vietnam. The military records contain reports of incidents comparable in character to My Lai, though generally smaller in scale, from throughout the war. A study commissioned by the military itself and conducted by a task force known as the Vietnam War Crimes Working Group compiled documentation of more than 300 incidents involving the killing, mutilation, or torture of civilians or prisoners by American forces. The study was classified and kept within the Army's files. It was not used as the basis for prosecution. It was discovered by a journalist named Nick Terse in the early 2000s through archival research. Terse spent years interviewing veterans who had participated in or witnessed such incidents and who had largely not spoken publicly about them. His account, published in 2013, described a pattern of violence against civilians that was widespread enough to be described as systematic rather than exceptional. The Free Fire Zone was one of the mechanisms by which this pattern was institutionalized. Large areas of South Vietnam were designated as free fire zones, later renamed specified strike zones, in an apparent recognition that the original terminology was not great for public relations. In a free fire zone, American and South Vietnamese forces were authorized to engage any target without the normal requirements for positive identification of combatants. Anyone present in a free fire zone could be treated as an enemy combatant. The zones were established in areas that were deemed to be under enemy control or enemy influence. They were sometimes established without adequate notification to civilians in those areas. Civilians who remained in free fire zones because they had nowhere else to go, because they were too old or too ill to relocate, because they did not receive adequate warning, because they were attached to their land, were designated as enemy combatants by virtue of their presence. The effects of Agent Orange are still accumulating. The United States military sprayed approximately 20 million gallons of herbicide across South Vietnam, parts of Laos and parts of Cambodia between 1961 and 1971, under a program called Operation Ranch Hand. The most widely used herbicide was Agent Orange, which contained dioxin as a contaminant at levels that were known to the manufacturer and not fully disclosed to the military or to the public. The stated purpose of the spraying was defoliation, the destruction of the jungle canopy under which enemy forces were able to move and conceal themselves, and the destruction of crops that might sustain enemy forces. Dioxin is one of the most toxic synthetic compounds known. Even in minute quantities, it causes cancer, birth defects, neurological damage, and other serious health conditions. The veterans who were exposed to Agent Orange during the spraying operations developed cancers and other illnesses at rates that significantly exceeded control populations. Their children were born with birth defects at elevated rates. The Vietnamese population that was exposed to the spraying and that continued to be exposed to dioxin that persisted in the soil and water long after the spraying ended experienced similar and in many cases more severe effects. The Vietnamese Red Cross estimates that 3 million Vietnamese have been affected by dioxin exposure, including around 150,000 children born with serious birth defects attributable to their parents' or grandparents' exposure. The Dow Chemical Company and Monsanto, the primary manufacturers of Agent Orange, had internal documentation showing that their product was contaminated with dioxin and that the contamination was toxic. This documentation was not shared with the military at the time. When veterans began to sue the manufacturers for damages related to Agent Orange exposure, those companies settled for approximately $180 million in 1984 without admitting liability. The United States government eventually acknowledged the connection between Agent Orange exposure and a list of specific conditions for veterans and began providing disability compensation. The Vietnamese government's requests for similar compensation from the United States have not been honored. The soldiers who fought the war in its later stages were fighting a war that the people running it had largely given up on winning. By 1969 and 1970, following Nixon's election on a platform that included a secret plan to end the war, the official policy had shifted from winning to withdrawing in a way that did not look too much like losing. Vietnamization, as the policy was called, involved the gradual transfer of combat responsibility to South Vietnamese forces while American troops were withdrawn. The policy had a certain political logic. It also had a military logic problem, which was that if the South Vietnamese military was capable of assuming responsibility for its own defense against North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces, it was not clear why American involvement had been necessary for so long, and if it was not capable, then the withdrawal was not a transfer of responsibility, but an abandonment. The soldiers who were fighting on the ground during this period knew something that most of them could not fully articulate, but that shaped every aspect of their service. They knew that no one in the chain of command believed the war was going to be won. They knew that they were being asked to risk their lives not to achieve a military objective, but to provide political cover for a withdrawal that had already been decided. The effect of this knowledge on morale was not a gradual erosion. It was more like a dissolution. The structures that usually sustain military discipline and cohesion, the belief that the mission matters, that the hierarchy knows what it is doing, that the sacrifice is connected to something that will outlast the sacrifice, those structures had largely ceased to function. The fragging phenomenon is one of the clearest documented expressions of this dissolution. Fragging refers to the murder or attempted murder of officers and non-commissioned officers by enlisted men, the term deriving from the fragmentation grenade that was sometimes used as the weapon. The practice existed in earlier American wars, but the documented incidence of fragging in Vietnam was unprecedented. The Army's own records show nearly 900 confirmed or suspected fragging incidents between 1969 and 1972. Estimates of the actual number, including incidents that were classified as accidental deaths or battlefield casualties, are considerably higher. Officers who were seen as unnecessarily aggressive, who ordered missions that soldiers considered pointless or suicidal, who were too eager to make contact with the enemy in a period when everyone knew the war was winding down, became targets. The fragging incidents were not random. They were, in their own terrible way, a form of communication. They were expressing something that the military system had made it impossible to express through legitimate channels. In an institution where questioning orders was not an option, where pessimism was not a career-enhancing position, where the requirement to be optimistic about the war's prospects extended all the way down to the level of the enlisted soldier, the men who had lost faith in the mission and who were being ordered to continue risking their lives for it, expressed their refusal in the only language available to them. The Army responded to the fragging problem partly by improving its reporting mechanisms and partly by changing how officers were deployed, making them rotate through combat positions more quickly so that enlisted men would have less time to develop grievances specific to a particular leader. It did not respond by re-examining the conditions that had made fragging seem like a viable option to hundreds of men. Drug use in Vietnam reached levels that the military eventually had to acknowledge because it was impossible to pretend they were not affecting operational readiness. By 1971, a congressional investigation estimated that around 1 in 3 soldiers had used heroin during their service in Vietnam. Marijuana use was even more widespread. The availability of cheap, high-quality heroin in Southeast Asia, combined with the conditions of the war, the boredom of base camp life, the terror of combat, the absence of any coherent mission that soldiers could believe in, the knowledge that the war was winding down without having been won, created conditions in which drug use was less an aberration than an adaptation. It was a way of managing an experience that had no other available management strategies. The military responded initially with surprise, and then with the mechanisms typically available to a large institution confronting a behavioral problem it has not anticipated. It established drug treatment programs. It conducted urinalysis testing. It created penalties for possession and use. It did not substantially address the conditions that were producing the drug use in such quantities. When soldiers returned home addicted to heroin, the Veterans Administration was not adequately equipped to treat them. The infrastructure for treatment did not match the scale of the problem. Many veterans who came home addicted remained addicted for years. Some never recovered. The connection between their addiction and their service was often not acknowledged in any official way. The experience of black soldiers in Vietnam is a chapter that runs alongside the main narrative without being fully integrated into it, and its separation from the main narrative is itself part of the story. Black Americans served in Vietnam in proportions that exceeded their share of the general population during the early years of the war, partly as a result of the Selective Service System's draft deferment policies, which disproportionately benefited college-educated men who were disproportionately white. By 1967, black soldiers accounted for about 12% of military personnel in Vietnam, but suffered about 22% of combat deaths. That disparity prompted enough public attention that the military adjusted its assignment policies, and by the end of the war, the casualty rates were roughly proportional. But the casualty rate was only one dimension of the racial dynamics of the war. Black soldiers experienced the war in a military institution that was, for most of the war's duration, still substantially shaped by the racial attitudes of the society that produced it. Promotions were slower. Assignments to the most dangerous positions were more common. Courts-martial and non-judicial punishment were applied more frequently and more severely to black soldiers than to white soldiers who committed comparable infractions. This is documented in the military's own records from the period. The Army conducted an internal study in the early 1970s that found systematic racial disparities in punishment rates across every branch and every theater of operations. The study's findings were not widely publicized. The racial tension inside American military units in Vietnam occasionally broke into open conflict. In 1969 and 1971, there were documented incidents at military bases in which fights between black and white soldiers produced casualties. There were incidents in which black soldiers refused orders on the grounds that they were being assigned to more dangerous tasks than white soldiers. There were incidents in which the fraternization between black soldiers and the civilian population of South Vietnam produced hostility from white soldiers and from local South Vietnamese, whose own racial attitudes were complex and sometimes hostile. The military's official position was that it was managing these tensions adequately. The testimonies of soldiers from that period paint a considerably more chaotic picture. The South Vietnamese military, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, which Americans called the ARVN, was a subject about which the official position required the most sustained and elaborate management of perception. The entire logic of Americanization, the commitment of hundreds of thousands of American troops, required the premise that the South Vietnamese needed American support to develop the capacity to defend themselves. The entire logic of Vietnamization, the withdrawal of American troops, required the premise that the South Vietnamese had developed sufficient capacity to defend themselves without that support. Both premises could not be true simultaneously, and there was considerable evidence at various points that neither was true. The ARVN was an institution with severe structural problems that American training and equipment and advisory programs were not able to fully address. Its officer corps was deeply politicized, with promotions and command positions often reflecting political loyalty to the South Vietnamese government rather than military competence. Unit cohesion was often weak, partly because units were frequently shuffled in ways that disrupted the development of the small unit trust that effective combat requires. Desertion rates were persistently high. The military effectiveness of ARVN units varied enormously, with some units performing creditably in combat and others collapsing under pressure in ways that their American advisors found impossible to explain to superiors who needed them to be performing creditably. American military advisors embedded with ARVN units wrote reports throughout the war describing these problems. The reports were read, aggregated, incorporated into assessments, and generally responded to with training programs and equipment transfers that addressed the symptoms without addressing the underlying structural problems. The structural problems were not primarily military, they were political. A military institution that reflects the dysfunction of the political system it serves cannot be fully reformed through training and equipment. The political system would have had to change first, and the political system, the government of South Vietnam, was itself an entity whose relationship to the population it was supposed to represent was at best complicated, and at worst entirely fictional. The Vietnamese population's relationship to the war was not the simple narrative of a people fighting for freedom against communist aggression that American policy required it to be. It was also not the simple narrative of a people unanimously committed to reunification and liberation under North Vietnamese leadership that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong propaganda required it to be. It was a population that had been at war under various colonial powers and under various forms of internal division for most of the 20th century. It was a population with deep local loyalties, with complex relationships between villages and provinces and regions that cut across the ideological divisions that outside powers were imposing on the conflict. It was a population that largely wanted the war to be over and had varying and contextual views about which of the competing forces was most likely to bring that about. The pacification program, the American effort to win the loyalty of the South Vietnamese population through a combination of security, development, and governance improvement, was an attempt to address this complexity. It produced a body of doctrine and an administrative apparatus that was, in parts, thoughtfully designed. It also produced body count requirements and quota systems and the Phoenix program, and a series of forced relocations in which entire villages were moved to government-controlled areas to separate the population from the guerrilla forces who operated among them. The relocations were called strategic hamlets in the early period and various other names at various other times. They involved the destruction of the villages that were being vacated, the burning of homes, and the killing of livestock, in order to prevent the displaced population from returning. The effect of these relocations on the political loyalties of the people subjected to them was not, on the whole, favorable. The Buddhist crisis of 1963 was a moment that exposed the nature of the South Vietnamese government in ways that made American support for it more difficult to sustain publicly. The government of Ngo Dinh Diem was Catholic in a predominantly Buddhist country. Its policies, including restrictions on the public display of Buddhist flags during religious holidays, its enforcement of a law against crowds of more than 7 people without government permission, and its general treatment of Buddhist institutions as politically suspect, had been generating increasing tension for years. In May 1963, government troops fired on a crowd at a Buddhist celebration in Hue, killing 9 people. Protests spread across the country. In June, a Buddhist monk named Thich Quang Duc sat down at an intersection in Saigon, was doused in gasoline by fellow monks, and lit himself on fire. He burned to death without making a sound, in a posture of complete composure. Photographs of his immolation were published around the world. Diem's sister-in-law, Madame Nhu, who was one of the most public faces of the regime and who had a talent for saying exactly the wrong thing at exactly the wrong moment, described the monk's death as a barbecue. The response of the United States government was not an immediate denunciation of the regime it was supporting. It was a period of internal deliberation about whether the regime's political liabilities were outweighing its usefulness. In August 1963, Diem ordered South Vietnamese special forces to raid Buddhist pagodas across the country, arresting hundreds of monks and nuns. The raids made the continuation of American public support for the Diem government essentially untenable. In November 1963, with American awareness and implicit approval, South Vietnamese military officers staged a coup. Diem was arrested. He and his brother were shot in the back of an armored vehicle while being transported to military headquarters. The coup was described by the Kennedy administration, which died itself 3 weeks later, as a South Vietnamese internal affair. The United States had not ordered the coup. It had declined to intervene to prevent it, which was not the same thing. The governments that followed Diem were, with few exceptions, no more effective and no more genuinely representative of the South Vietnamese population. There were 9 governments in the year following the coup. The political instability that resulted was one of the reasons the Johnson administration concluded that a massive increase in American military involvement was necessary to prevent the collapse of the South Vietnamese state. The rules of engagement under which American forces operated in Vietnam were a set of instructions governing when and how military force could be used. They were designed to balance military effectiveness against the political requirements of limiting civilian casualties, avoiding diplomatic incidents with neighboring countries, and managing the public presentation of the war. In practice, they were modified repeatedly as circumstances changed, and their application in the field was inconsistent, and their violation was common enough to be in some contexts normative. The restrictions on bombing near populated areas were a source of persistent frustration for military commanders who argued that the restrictions were preventing them from destroying enemy infrastructure that was located near civilian areas precisely because the enemy knew those areas were protected. The restrictions on pursuing enemy forces across the borders into Cambodia and Laos created what military planners called sanctuaries. Areas from which the enemy could operate and into which American forces could not follow. The frustration with these sanctuaries was one of the political and military dynamics that eventually led to the secret bombing of Cambodia, which began in 1969 under Nixon and was kept secret from Congress and the American public for more than a year. The secret bombing of Cambodia was authorized by Nixon shortly after taking office and was given the code name Operation Menu. Individual missions within the operation were named after courses of a meal. The bombing targeted North Vietnamese and Viet Cong base areas and supply lines in eastern Cambodia, in areas of Cambodia that were under effective North Vietnamese control and from which operations into South Vietnam were being staged. The military logic was sound, in the narrow sense that the targets were genuinely military and the bombing did damage those targets. The constitutional logic was not sound. Congress had not authorized military operations in Cambodia. The administration had not informed Congress that the operations were occurring. Records of the bombing missions were falsified. Aircrews were told to file false after-action reports indicating that the missions had taken place in South Vietnam. Senior officers who knew the true location of the missions were instructed to conceal that information. The bombing of Cambodia was revealed to the public in May 1969 when a report appeared in the New York Times. Nixon responded by ordering the FBI to place wiretaps on the phones of several journalists and National Security Council staff members to find the source of the leak. The wiretapping program was one of the precursors to the broader program of political intelligence and sabotage operations that eventually became Watergate. The bombing itself continued. When Nixon announced in April 1970 that American and South Vietnamese forces were entering Cambodia, he described it as an incursion rather than an invasion, as an operation targeting specific enemy sanctuaries rather than as an expansion of the war into a neutral country, and as a temporary operation that had been necessitated by enemy aggression. The bombing that had been occurring for more than a year without public knowledge was not mentioned. It continued for 3 more years. The peace negotiations that eventually produced the Paris Peace Accords of January 1973 were preceded by years of intermittent talks that were interrupted, delayed, complicated, and on at least one occasion deliberately sabotaged for domestic political purposes. The 1968 negotiations, which the Johnson administration had hoped would produce an agreement before the presidential election, were derailed in part through an effort by Richard Nixon's campaign to persuade South Vietnamese leadership to delay meaningful engagement with the talks until after the election, on the premise that a Nixon administration would provide better terms for South Vietnam. Anna Chenol, a prominent Republican fundraiser with extensive connections to South Vietnamese officials, served as an informal intermediary in this effort. FBI wiretaps and National Security Agency intercepts documented the communications. Johnson was informed. He chose not to make the information public, partly because doing so would have required acknowledging the surveillance program. Nixon won the election. The war continued for more than 4 more years. The Paris Peace Accords, when they finally arrived, did not end the war so much as they ended American direct military involvement in it. The accords required the withdrawal of American forces, the return of prisoners of war, and a ceasefire. They did not resolve the fundamental political question of who governed South Vietnam. They left North Vietnamese forces in place in the portions of South Vietnam they controlled. They established mechanisms for political reconciliation that both sides immediately began violating. Nixon described the accords as achieving peace with honor. The honorable part was primarily the return of American prisoners. The peace lasted for approximately as long as it took both sides to rearm and reposition. The fall of Saigon on April 30, 1975, is one of those events that people think they understand because they have seen the images. The helicopters on the roof of the CIA station being pushed into the sea to make room for more. The crowds outside the American embassy. The South Vietnamese soldiers discarding their uniforms. The images are real, but they are a conclusion that followed from a logic that had been building for years and that had been visible to anyone who was paying attention without the requirement of optimism. The North Vietnamese Easter Offensive of 1972, the largest conventional military operation of the war, had demonstrated that South Vietnamese forces could hold their positions against a major North Vietnamese assault with massive American air support. When that air support was withdrawn, the military balance shifted. The South Vietnamese military in 1975 faced a different situation from what it had faced in 1972. The American funding that sustained it had been reduced by congressional action. The morale of an institution that had been fighting for decades had been further eroded. When the North Vietnamese began their final offensive in late 1974 and early 1975, the collapse of South Vietnamese resistance was faster than even the North Vietnamese had planned for. They had prepared for a 2-year campaign. It took 55 days. The Americans who were evacuated from Saigon left behind South Vietnamese who had worked with them, who had believed that the American commitment was something that would be honored, who had in some cases taken actions based on that belief that made them targets for the incoming government. The evacuation was chaotic and incomplete. The number of Vietnamese evacuated in the final days was a fraction of the number who had grounds to fear retribution. Many of those left behind were imprisoned. Some were executed. Some spent years in re-education camps. The American government's processing of refugees who did escape was slow and inadequate. The reception of Vietnamese refugees in the United States was not uniformly welcoming. The question of prisoners of war and soldiers listed as missing in action became one of the most politically durable legacies of the war. The official accounting listed more than 2,000 American servicemen as unaccounted for at the war's end. Families of those men refused to accept the official position that no prisoners remained alive in Vietnam. The live prisoner issue became a focus of sustained advocacy and political organizing that influenced American foreign policy toward Vietnam for decades. The actual evidence for live American prisoners being held in Vietnam after 1973 was never substantial, and dedicated investigators, including the Senate Select Committee on POW and MIA Affairs, which conducted an extensive investigation in 1991 and 1992, concluded that there was no credible evidence that American prisoners remained alive in Vietnam. The committee's findings did not end the controversy. The belief that prisoners had been abandoned was too useful to too many people to be easily dislodged by evidence. The veterans who came home from Vietnam came back to a country that did not know how to receive them. The homecoming experience varied enormously depending on where a veteran came home to, when in the war's timeline they returned, and what class and community context they were returning to. The image of returning veterans being spat upon by anti-war protesters has been studied by researchers and found to be largely mythological as a widespread phenomenon, though individual incidents certainly occurred. The more common experience was not hostility, it was indifference. Veterans who needed to talk about what they had experienced found that the social context for those conversations did not exist. The war was already becoming something people wanted to stop thinking about. The veterans were the most visible reminder of it. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not a diagnosis that existed in its current form when the Vietnam veterans were coming home. The condition existed, had been documented under various names in various wars, but the diagnostic and treatment infrastructure had not been built to address it at the scale that the Vietnam War produced. Veterans who were experiencing the symptoms that are now recognized as post-traumatic stress were often told that their symptoms were character weaknesses or alcohol problems or adjustment difficulties. The Veterans Administration, which was responsible for their care, was for many years severely underfunded and insufficiently staffed to address the scope of what it was seeing. Studies conducted in the 1980s found that significant percentages of Vietnam veterans were experiencing clinically significant symptoms of PTSD years after their service had ended. The War Crimes Tribunal, organized by Bertrand Russell and Jean-Paul Sartre, which convened in 1967 and heard testimony about American actions in Vietnam, was dismissed by American officials as a propaganda exercise conducted by people who had no standing and no legal authority. The testimony the tribunal heard was not fabricated. It came from people who had participated in the events they described. The tribunal's conclusions were partisan and politically motivated. The underlying testimony was real. The gap between those two facts, between the real content and the politically compromised container, is one that the American institutional response consistently used as a reason to dismiss the content along with the container. The Winter Soldier investigation of 1971, organized by Vietnam Veterans Against the War, heard testimony from more than 100 veterans describing acts they had participated in or witnessed during their service in Vietnam. The testimony included accounts of the killing of civilians, the torture of prisoners, the destruction of villages, the use of prohibited weapons, and other conduct that, if true, constituted war crimes under the laws of war that the United States was publicly committed to observing. The testimony received minimal coverage in the mainstream press. The Defense Department did not investigate it. The Congress did not hold hearings on it. John Kerry's appearance before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in April 1971 during which he summarized some of what the Winter Soldier investigation had produced, was more widely covered, but primarily in the context of the debate about continuing the war rather than in the context of accountability for what had occurred. The question of accountability is the thread that runs through all of this and arrives nowhere satisfying. Lieutenant Calley was the only person convicted of crimes related to My Lai. The officers who covered up the massacre were not prosecuted. The architects of the Phoenix program were never charged with anything. The officials who authorized and supervised the bombing of Laos and Cambodia were not held accountable. The people who fabricated and inflated the intelligence that was used to justify escalations were not held accountable. The people who maintained the false picture of the war's progress for years while privately knowing it was false were not held accountable. Most of them continued their careers. Some published memoirs. Some became respected elder statesmen. Robert McNamara published a memoir in 1995 in which he described his private doubts about the war and his failure to act on them. He described it as a tragedy. He did not describe it as a crime. The language that the war produced is worth pausing on. Collateral damage for civilian deaths. Pacification for operations that sometimes amounted to the destruction of the areas being pacified. Termination with extreme prejudice. A phrase whose bureaucratic blandness makes its actual meaning, assassination, somehow more disturbing rather than less. Strategic hamlet for relocation program, free fire zone for an area where anything that moved could be killed, body count for a metric so corrupt it had ceased to measure anything real, enhanced interrogation, which would come later but whose lineage runs directly through the practices of this war. The language was not accidental. It was engineered to allow certain things to be discussed without being described. It is still in use. The war in Vietnam produced approximately 58,000 American deaths. It produced between 1.5 and 2 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong military deaths, depending on whose estimates are used, and estimates vary because the North Vietnamese did not keep public records and their archives remain largely closed. It produced civilian deaths in South Vietnam, estimated at between 2 and 3 million. It produced civilian deaths in North Vietnam from the bombing campaigns estimated at between 50,000 and 200,000, with the wide range reflecting the difficulty of assessment rather than uncertainty about whether the deaths occurred. It produced civilian deaths in Cambodia from the bombing campaigns that are estimated at somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000, a range so wide that it should be understood not as an estimate but as an acknowledgement that no one knows. The war ended officially in 1975. The fighting did not stop. The Khmer Rouge, whose rise to power was substantially enabled by the destabilization of Cambodia that the American bombing campaign contributed to, began in 1975 the systematic murder of somewhere between 1.5 and 2 million Cambodian people, a proportion of the Cambodian population that has no peacetime parallel in the 20th century. The connection between the American bombing of Cambodia and the conditions that produced the Khmer Rouge is not a simple causal claim. It is a claim about contributing factors in a complex system, and it is supported by historians who have examined the evidence without partisan interest in a particular conclusion. It is also disputed. The dispute, like most disputes about the war, tends to follow the contours of what the people involved need to believe rather than the contours of the evidence. Vietnam and the United States normalized diplomatic relations in 1995. American veterans began returning to Vietnam to see the places where they had served. Some found what they were looking for. Some found that the places had changed in ways that made the finding difficult. Some found that the Vietnamese people they met were less interested in the war than in the present, less interested in relitigating who had done what than in the practical questions of the economy and their children's futures. The Vietnamese have their own official narrative of the war, which is also a management of perception, which also serves institutional purposes, which is also not identical to the complex reality it purports to describe. The men who fought the war aged. Some talked about it, some did not. The ones who talked about it in the years immediately after the war often found that the words available to them were not adequate to what they were trying to describe. The experience of combat, the specific experience of this particular war, with its specific moral conditions and its specific institutional context, resisted the narrative frameworks that were available. It was not a story with a clear arc. It was not a story that moved from challenge to resolution. It did not have a satisfying shape. The veterans who tried to describe it in those terms found that the description did not feel true, and the veterans who refused to impose those terms on it often found that they had nothing to offer instead. The memorials and commemorations that followed the war organized around loss rather than around any coherent account of what the loss had been for. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, the black granite wall inscribed with the names of the dead, was controversial when it was proposed and became, after its completion, perhaps the most visited and most genuinely affecting memorial in the country. Its power comes partly from its refusal to explain. It offers only names and their absence. It does not tell you what the names died for. It does not suggest that there is a clear answer to that question. It allows grief without requiring justification. The lessons of Vietnam were proclaimed regularly for decades after the war ended, in contexts ranging from subsequent American military interventions to academic literature to political speeches. The lessons varied according to who was drawing them. The lesson that the military drew was largely operational, that the next war needed to be fought differently, with clearer objectives and more decisive force and less political interference in military decisions. The lesson that others drew was more fundamental, that the conditions that had produced the war in the first place, the overreach of executive authority, the corruption of intelligence by political requirements, the gap between public justification and private reasoning, were the things that needed examination. Neither set of lessons was fully absorbed. Both sets were eventually needed again. The soldiers who came back from Vietnam and the soldiers who went to Iraq and Afghanistan a generation later met each other at various points, in veterans groups and VA hospitals, and in families where service was multi-generational. What passed between them included things that were not easily said out loud. The specific mechanisms were different. The specific geography was different. Some of the specific failures were different. The texture of certain experiences, the disconnect between official accounts and operational reality, the sensation of fighting a war whose purpose had become unclear, the difficulty of explaining what that was like to people who had not been there. Those things had a recognizable shape. The Vietnamese who had fought on the South Vietnamese side, those who had survived and made it out, built communities in the United States and other countries, and carried with them a grief that did not fit neatly into either the American story of the war or the North Vietnamese story of the war. They were the remnant of a project that had failed, and the failure was not entirely their own and not entirely anyone else's. They had fought for something. What they had fought for had ended. They went on. The declassification of documents has continued in the decades since the war ended, slowly and incompletely, and each tranche of documents reveals something that adjusts the official account in some direction or other. The adjustments are rarely dramatic. The broad outlines of what happened have been visible for a long time to people who were looking. What the documents reveal, more than new facts, is the texture of how the decisions were made, the specific language in which officials communicated their private doubts to each other while preparing their public assurances, the specific calculations by which individual careers and institutional reputations were protected at the cost of the mission, the specific moments when the gap between what was known and what was said became decisive. The war in Vietnam cost the United States approximately $140 billion in direct expenditures, a figure that does not include the long-term costs of veteran care, which are ongoing and still accumulating. It cost the United States its confidence in its own institutions in ways that took decades to partly recover and that have never been entirely resolved. It cost the people of Southeast Asia things that do not appear in any ledger and for which no accounting has been made. The Army commissioned studies. The studies were classified. Some were eventually declassified. Some are still classified. The National Security Archive, working through Freedom of Information requests over many years, has made portions of those studies available to researchers. The researchers have written books. The books have been published. Most of them are out of print. The institutions that the books describe continue to operate. The last American combat forces left South Vietnam in March 1973, following the Paris Peace Accords. A small number of military personnel remained as advisors and in support roles. The combat assistance that the United States continued to provide was primarily in the form of air power and military equipment and funding. When the North Vietnamese final offensive began in 1975, the funding had been reduced and the air power was not coming back. The advisors who remained in the country until the very end did their jobs as long as their jobs remained definable, and then they were evacuated, and then the war went on without them for 55 more days, until it was over.